welcome everyone. We're really pleased to have so many of you with us here today for This Is CDR. So a background on our program here. This is our online event series presented by OpenAir Collective to explore the range of carbon dioxide removal solutions currently being researched, developed, and deployed, and to contextualize them for our policy proposals under development in New York State and other states and jurisdictions. I'm Jared Hunter. I'm filling in today for our usual co-host, Toby Bryce. And like everyone at OpenAir, I'm a volunteer. I live in New York City and contribute to our advocacy efforts, community building, and I work behind the scenes on This Is CDR. Just some background on OpenAir. We're a distributed volunteer network dedicated to the advancement of carbon dioxide removal solutions, which are essential to solving the climate crisis. Our community collaborates on shared open source missions in the areas of R&D, policy advocacy, and CDR market development. There'll be links to our website and Twitter in the chat, and please follow us there and join up. You do not need to be an expert in chemistry or anything. I'm just a layman, and you can still contribute to our missions here. I'm just going to give a little background on CDR. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it, but CDR is the practice of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it safely for a long period of time in the geosphere, ocean, or other long-lived products. Of course, when considering CDR as we are today, it's essential to emphasize that CDR is not in any way an alternative to reducing emissions. We have to reduce our global emissions and decarbonize our economy as quickly and completely as possible. That said, every credible climate forecast, including the most recent IPCC assessment report, co-authored by one of today's guests, shows that CDR will be required at gigaton scale, that's billions of tons per year, by mid-century to counteract those emissions that are difficult or inequitable to abate, and ultimately to start removing the excess CO2 already in the atmosphere so we can restore our climate to a safer and healthier state. If you're new to CDR, past This Is CDR sessions are a great place to start. There will be links to those recordings on YouTube in our chat, along with a link to the CDR primer, which is a great comprehensive resource if you really want to dig into more about CDR. And of course, we're here today to learn more. And there will be sessions every week on Tuesdays. So you can follow us on Eventbrite to find out more about those sessions. So now I'm going to turn things over to our OpenAir co-founder, Chris Neidl, who I might add is here today despite suffering from a case of COVID. So how's that for dedication? Chris will introduce our guest and will be moderating the audience Q&A later. So over to you, Chris.
Great. Thanks so much, Jared. Appreciate the kind words, and I'll give you some as well. In addition to the different ways in which Jared contributes to the community that he just mentioned, he is also a very talented jingle maker. So those of you who are familiar with OpenAir's beloved jingle that's at the beginning and end of most of our videos, that is a product of Jared's work. And he also really is the main sort of force making our Discord platform work a lot more better and more efficiently. So very grateful for Jared for filling in and for all he does. Really excited about today. My name is Chris Neidl, as Jared just mentioned. I'm one of the co-founders of OpenAir. I'm a New Yorker based in Monteverde, Costa Rica. And today's episode is highly anticipated because Dr. Nemet's influence over OpenAir's approach and I think assumptions about change and how to make a difference are great. I think if we had a drinking game for every time Professor Nemet was mentioned on our Discord or our events, we'd all be pretty hammered. So I'm really excited to have this discussion today. Just some housekeeping notes before we get started. We're going to have a 15 to 20 minute presentation from Professor Nemet. Then we're going to be followed by some prepared questions that have been sourced from our community that Jared will go over. And then I'll go ahead and moderate an audience Q&A. So as Jared said, please type any questions you have into the Q&A box, not the chat box, if you can avoid it, through the Q&A. And this event is recorded, so we're going to send the video link around hopefully by tomorrow. With the recording of the video, which is posted on our YouTube channel, along with every other past episode of This Is CDR. And then we're also going to be live tweeting today's event as well. So we'll put our Twitter link in the chat, and please follow along. And definitely, if you tweet, use the hashtag This Is CDR. Great. And now for the main event. This week, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Gregory Nemet of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the author of How Solar Became Cheap. And he's here to teach us about low carbon innovation and how we can push carbon dioxide removal down the cost curve. Professor Nemet is a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, as I mentioned, in the Follette School of Public Affairs. He teaches courses in energy systems analysis, policy analysis, and international environmental policy. Greg's research focuses on understanding the process of technological change and the ways in which public policy can affect it. He received his doctorate in energy and resources from the University of California at Berkeley, his BA in geography and economics from Dartmouth College, and he received an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship in 2017 and used it to write his excellent book, which we can't recommend enough, on solar, called How Solar Energy Became Cheap. He was awarded the inaugural World Citizen Prize in Environmental Performance by APPAM in 2019, and he is currently the lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's sixth assessment report. So thank you for being here, Professor Nemet, and over to you.
Thanks, Chris. What a great introduction. And let me just put some slides up for a few minutes here. Yeah, so great to be here. Really nice to participate in your community. And just a couple of things just to start off. So yeah, I do want to talk about, so just a couple of things to start here. So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about lessons from solar. Let me briefly just mention a project that's ongoing now. It just started about exactly a year ago, and it's a 6-year project funded by the European Research Council. And so it's Wisconsin collaborating with 3 research institutes in Europe, doing a comprehensive assessment of what we're calling geoengineering and negative emissions pathways in Europe. And I'm really excited about this project. It's a 6-year project, so we'll be really able to dig in. It's working with some great colleagues in Europe. I'm spending a lot of time over there understanding the policies, the social acceptance, and the part that I'm really working most on in that project is how do we learn from the past to scale up carbon dioxide removal so that it's material for addressing the climate issue. And so I'll talk a little bit about some initial results from that, and also a little bit about what we've already done, talking about the solar case. So one thing that's motivated a lot of my work on this is some work we did a few years ago now, is to look at what these computer models called integrated assessment models. The IPCC relies on them heavily to understand what happens to interactions in the energy system, the climate system, and then what happens when you start to do things like we need to reduce emissions so that we get to net zero by 2050 to meet 1.5 degree or 2 degree targets. And so one thing we've extracted from hundreds of those scenario runs is to look at how much negative emissions we'll need by mid-century. And you can see here on the top panel that we're talking about going from something that's pretty negligible today to on the order of, I use a number of 5 billion tons a year. So 5 gigatons. And, just to put it in perspective, that's about 10% of the emissions we put up into the atmosphere. So we're talking about maybe solving 10% of the climate problem by moving emissions in the other direction. So when we say negative emissions, that's what we're talking about there. But, crucial is, we're talking about going from almost nothing even in 2030 to billions of tons by 2050. And the question is, how do we get there? And so one thing that we did using this technique called systemic mapping, where we look at the literature using machine learning techniques to identify papers on CDR and then to identify innovation stages. And what we found is that something like half the papers that are out there are really just talking about R&D. And that if we take what we know from previous technologies, solar, but many others as well, is there's generally a progression from R&D to demonstrations to scale up niche markets, thinking about demand and public acceptance. Crucial to have feedbacks in each of those stages going to earlier stages. But when we look at what the literature is talking about, it's mostly on R&D, a little bit on scale up, and not enough on the right-hand side there on demand side factors. So this is something in our project we're going to update and look at, see if we have a more a bigger focus on the right-hand side in recent years, but that's kind of my premise going into this work, is that it's great to see the work on research and improving materials and new techniques and new devices and patenting and all that stuff. But if we're going to actually do what's in the top panel, we need to get much more serious on the right-hand side on working about on demand. Okay, here's another item that we just kind of use to put the scale up in perspective, and that is to look at what we know from the history of solar, which has been a huge success. It's now 3% of global electricity supply, but growing at 30% a year. And so if you just keep compounding that, you know, it'll take over global electricity if it keeps growing at that by the end of the 2030s. And so solar is a big success. The first commercial solar contract was in 1957. The first low-cost contract where solar beat fossil fuels without subsidies was in 2017. And then we're talking about getting to, say, 50% of energy supply by the 2040s. It took a long time to get there. And so if we just say, let's emulate solar with, say, direct air capture, where the first commercial deployment was in 2017, that doesn't get us to the gigatons we need by 2050. And so what we need to do is go much faster. So that accelerated development is all about what we're working on in the Genie project, is how do we make things go faster? Solar is great, but it's not fast enough. And we need much faster for direct air capture. So we need something like a factor of 4 from development times to low cost, and then from low cost to widespread adoption, which ultimately is what we need. We have an example in the last couple of years of, you know, developing a vaccine and doing that 4 times faster than the world record, which was for measles in the 1950s. And so we did it in a year. And so that's the kind of thing we need to do with direct air capture compared to solar. We also have some evidence that we can scale up quickly. And so those colored lines on the left are companies that make solar modules in different places. So Sharp in Japan, Q-Cells in Germany, Suntech and Jinko in China. And you can see how quickly they scaled up. And note the left-hand vertical axis there it's a logarithmic scale. So they're going up for factors of 10. So these are growth rates of close to 100% on the steepest parts there. At one time, there is a company called Climeworks that used to have an objective to remove 1% of global emissions by 2025. And so one thing we did is just plot how that looks compared to the solar scale up. And, you know, it's faster. It's probably twice as fast, but it's not an order of magnitude faster. And so some of these precedents we have in other areas are exactly what we're going to need to do if we're going to get to 2050 gigatons. And I'll talk more about some of these growth rates in a few minutes. Okay, the other point I would make is that solar is a great model. We need to do it faster, but it doesn't work for everything in CDR. And so one thing that's just kind of part of the premise going into that Genie project that I talked about is that you can start to think of technologies having these kind of archetypes. So in the top row, we can think of technologies that have some technological components where there's some type of iteration. Maybe that's because they're small scale and you mass produce them and get lots of chances to improve them. Maybe there's a chance for disruptive innovation where you can make compromises on design and manufacturing choices that vastly reduce costs because the consequences of a failure are not very high, for example, through modularity. So there's a lot of ways in which solar PV and other technologies that fit in that archetype can inform things like low temperature direct air capture. In row 2, we can think about other ways of doing CDR where at least the distribution part is low tech. It's also small scale, but super distributed, many different adopters. You can think about the millions of landholders or farms that might be playing a role in sequestering permanently carbon in soils. And so there we start to look at other models. And the ones that we've already started to look at are things like the Green Revolution that included hybrid seeds and mass-produced fertilizer and irrigation and rolling that out on a global scale to lots of developing countries and that making a tremendous difference in food supply. And so that's one direction we're going in terms of informing things like soils. On the third row, there's the large-scale technologies. And in this case for CDR, it's probably bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. I would probably put high temperature direct air capture in that row as well, where you need different models. There, we're talking about system integration being the dominant challenge to overcome. And we've accomplished that in some places, like building chemical plants and oil refineries and things like that. And so using knowledge for how we've scaled up and built and financed and de-risked large-scale facilities like those, I think will be really instructive for things like BECCS and high temperature direct air capture. And then there's general purpose technologies that have had impacts throughout the system that we expect will be important for CDR as well, like AI and synthetic biology and things like that. And those have other ways of stimulating those. So multiple models depending on the different types of CDR we're thinking about. So taking model one, looking at the high-tech, iterative, disruptive technologies like low temperature carbon removal or direct air capture, we can look at how solar got cheap, not just that it is and just that it developed quickly. And so this is a summary of that book that Chris mentioned in one slide. And that's a couple things I'd just say on it. One is that there is a massive cost reduction here. So a factor of 10,000 from that first commercial purchase by the US Navy of solar panels to put them on a satellite to power purchase agreements are now well below $20 per megawatt hour. And just to put the figure in perspective, a megawatt hour is about what a US residential single family home uses in a month for electricity. So it's kind of like your electricity bill. And if you can do it from utility scale solar now in a sunny place, you'd pay less than $20 a month. If you took it from where solar was before, it was $300,000 a month. So there's been steady progress, but that's the other part. It's not a breakthrough. It's just steady incremental improvement over 4 orders of magnitude over 70 years with multiple countries playing a role. No one country did it. No country that had a lead ever sustained its lead for more than a decade or so. No company that was ever the biggest company in the world sustained its large market share for more than a few years. It was really very much a relay race. And part of the aspect of the relay race that was important is that there were these global flows of knowledge that allowed knowledge to move around in people's heads, in scientific data sets, in scientific papers, in conferences, and then in physical ways, and machines that moved around, in consultants that moved around from one country to another to optimize production facilities and supply chains that became globally integrated, and then products that were moving around and policies that learned from each place. And so the international aspects of solar were just such a crucial part of its pathway. And it's hard to see how, if we wanted to do something even faster than solar, that we could do this without using these international networks of people and ideas and capabilities in transportation and finance that was so crucial for solar. And so I think that's going to be crucial for going faster. One of the things you can see, I mean, we can do more on this in the Q&A, are some of the important policies that played a role, and you can see the different countries that played a role. But I think just to summarize it, and I think this is instructive before the next slide, if we think about how solar energy became cheap, I would put it into 3 phases. Is that one, the US played the biggest role in creating a technology. 2, Germany played the biggest role in creating a market. And 3, that China played the biggest role in getting it cheap. And you needed all of those, and there was a sequence to it, and there were feedbacks, and there was certainly this passing of the baton as well. And so I think there's a lot to learn from various CDR approaches, but especially the ones that fit that archetype of being high-tech, modular, and having lots of iterations available. And then just to think about this more prospectively, to go from the specifics of solar into some of the more general ideas that we could apply. I talked about these kind of 3 areas, and they roughly map into technology push, to creating the technology. Number 2, knowledge flows. Those are those international spillovers that are so crucial. And demand pull is creating markets. And one thing, maybe I'll highlight one in each row. One, public procurement was crucial for solar, where governments were initial customers for solar panels and designed procurement contracts in a way that stimulated improvements and that led companies to scale up. Second, the knowledge flows. I talked about the global aspects that were so crucial. And then finally, on the demand pull side, the one I'd highlight most is that robust markets, where it was important that there were expectations that there was a large market, that it was growing, and also that there would still be demand for solar even if there was a change like an election or a recession or something that might have changed the course of policy in one place, if there were other places, other countries that had uncorrelated policies, that was a much stronger signal. And that was crucial for solar, and I expect to be really crucial for something like CDR that needs to scale up quickly. So we can go back to that as well. Okay, and then here's some other work focusing on that type 1 archetype of why these small scales technologies seem to work so well. And this is something that I kind of learned, had to uneducate myself, because what I learned in grad school is that energy is a big, serious problem. The climate system is gigantic. And if we're going to do anything, it has to be big. And that means we need big technologies. And what it seems to be turning out is that that may not be right. It could turn out that small technologies may turn out to be more scalable than large ones. And there's lots of evidence for this now. And so here's one picture that shows the learning rate. So how much costs come down with every doubling of capacity. And you can see that on the left-hand side are small technologies like 1 watt, like a light bulb, that small like LED light bulb has a higher learning rate than the technologies on the far right, which is a gigawatt, like a large coal facility or nuclear power plant. So it does seem to be that smaller technologies learn faster than large ones. Second, they scale up faster. So the horizontal axis now is similar, except it's in money instead of watts. And the vertical axis now is not a learning rate, but how fast you go from 10% market share to 90% of the ultimate market share. And you can see there's also that relationship that large scale technologies take longer and much longer. They take several decades, whereas small scale technologies like LED lighting, that kind of thing, within 2 decades can actually get to their close to their ultimate market share. So there's something about small technologies that get adopted more quickly. And I think this is the reason for it, is that you get more chances to improve, more chances to alter the production, to add new technology, to experiment, lots of iterations. And again, we're using logarithmic scales because there's such a difference here. But look at this, nuclear power. We've made less than 1,000 nuclear reactors in the history of the nuclear power industry. And in about the same amount of time or less, we've made 3 billion solar panels and tens of millions of electric vehicles, coming up to tens of millions of wind turbines. Just think of how many more chances that is to improve or try something or experiment or learn from what hasn't worked or what has worked and get things going better. So the iterations, I think, is such a crucial aspect of why these small scale technologies seem to do better. Okay, so, and this is the last part I'll just show here, is looking at the scale up challenge. And, you know, just some pretty simple math. If we want to get from where we are today to gigatons in 2050, we need to grow at about 40% a year for 30 years. And that's a lot. Solar's done it, so maybe we just have to emulate solar. But we're asking more broadly, how realistic is it to sustain that growth for 30 years? I mean, is solar kind of an outlier and one that's a cool example, but not one we can hang our hat on? Well, so that's what we try to do, is look at what's happened in the past. We've looked at a large set of technologies. We've got about 100 data sets and growing now about how quickly technologies have improved. And here's kind of what we've looked at so far. So the dashed line there is this 40% target for CDR to get to gigatons by mid-century, 40% a year for 30 years. And you can see that there are some technologies that even the average technology in that sector, food and health, storage technology, and anything on digitalization, is above where we need to be. And then there's other technologies like energy and hardware, and then the large scale technologies like infrastructure, like railroads or materials and mining, that have moved slower than that. And so there's some evidence that we are able to get that 40%. And then the last part I'll show is to compare those historical technologies. That's on the left-hand box there, same 40% target there. Looking at what the scenarios say, which is actually lower than that, looking at what the literature says, which is also quite low, and then looking at company announcements and policy goals. And those are more sparse data sets. But one thing I'd say is that the companies and the policies are pretty much right on target. They're actually saying what needs to be done, which is we need to grow fast, 40 to 50% a year every year for the next few decades to get where we need to go. And I think the challenge now is to look at these historical technologies and say, which of those are actually going to get us where we need to go? And what is it about them that makes them grow quickly? And how could we apply those to CDR? So just to wrap up here, implications here, we should focus on technologies that are changing and have the potential to change, the potential to learn, the potential to get adopted quickly. Small unit size seems to be the answer for that, because small tile technologies grow faster, they learn faster, and I think it's probably because of all the iterations that you get chances to improve. Third point is that even in large units, you can think of maybe a bioenergy carbon capture plant or a high temperature direct air capture plant. We don't have those opportunities for many iterations. We just never will. We will never get into millions of those types of plants. So are there components there like contactors and things like that where you could get benefits of modularity and maybe also have some economies of scale for the parts like calciners that you actually want to have large and not have lots of units? So maybe there's a way to get a bit of the boast and a bit of the best of both of those in the large scale, but we'll have to see on those. Iterative improvement is crucial. And then ultimately local system integration has been crucial for solar. Now that it's cheap, the real issues are, how do we get it onto the grid? How do we get people in developing countries able to access it? How do we finance it? And those ultimately will become the big issues for CDR as well. How do we manage the distribution and reverse logistics of the captured CO2, for example, how it gets used and how it gets sequestered permanently? So I'll stop there. Thanks for the chance to talk about this to your group, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks, Greg. That was really great. Yeah, like Chris said, I'm a huge fan of your book, so I'm very glad to have you here and telling us all about this. We sort of have a tradition on the show of asking all our panelists the first question, just how did you get to where you are today? What's your, what drew you to this line of work, and how, what motivates you to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I was interested in the environment in college. I took a course on energy, a course on climate change. That was great. Went in a different direction after college. There weren't a lot of opportunities. I had big loans to pay off. Worked in management consulting for a few years. Did a healthcare startup in San Francisco in the first .com round in the late 1990s. Worked on Sand Hill Road at a think tank there. And one of the things that got me back into the energy space at that think tank is, we were surrounded by innovation and venture capital and these companies that were becoming, at the time, seemed gigantic. Now they seem tiny, but it was amazing what was happening. But it was striking how much effort there was going into these IT companies, biotech and consumer products, and almost nothing was going into energy. And yet the problem seemed so large and obvious that they were going to need to be dealt with. And so that's the question I took into grad school is, how could we stimulate innovation in low carbon technology so that people start working on energy issues and climate issues in the way that they were excited about e-commerce in the 1990s. And I think that's what we're seeing now. It's super gratifying and exciting. And I think that's one of the big reasons I'm optimistic is that people are devoting their careers to it. The investment is there. There's room to experiment and do startups in this space. And so, yeah, that's been the path to be working on this stuff.
Cool. That's great. I know we're here to talk about scaling up CDR, but since you're here, I did want to ask you one question, which is, we hear so much about these IPCC reports that come out. We actually have a lead author with us here today. So could you just tell us a little bit about what it's like to work on one of those reports? What makes it different from a typical academic paper or white paper, and just a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, two things. I guess one that makes it different is it's working with a lot of people, and it's a big, ambitious project and a lot of collaboration, coordination. So we worked on 3 years, we wrote hundreds of pages. We cited 20,000 references. We responded individually to 60,000 comments from experts and government officials that went through 3 rounds of commenting on the report. And so, that was just like, what a way to vet and improve and collaboratively get the information from all over the place, really structured way. So that was cool. But then there was this other part, which is you take those hundreds of pages and let's boil it down to what will be 20 pages of formatted text for a summary for policymakers. And because this is actually a UN process, it actually gets approved, not by other scientists like an academic journal article would be, but by governments, by delegations. And so that's what I did in the 2 weeks at the end of March into early April, is, well, drafting that summary, but then also getting it approved. And that was an intense process of listening to the comments of countries, taking their comments into account, coming back, working with other people on my team, of fixing the text and modifying it to address their comments. And then in a lot of cases saying, no, we can't change that because the science says we need to reduce fossil fuel emissions to stabilize the climate. There's no way we can, soften that statement or take it out. It's just, that's what the science says. And so those types of discussions end up took many hours and sometimes days to get them finally approved. So yeah, it was a difficult process because it was the science says this, but then the governments have all the veto power and they could say, we're not going to approve this report. And then, there was a sense that at one point where we might not even get it approved at all. But in the end, I was really heartened by the fact that the main messages that came out of it were the ones that we had going into it. And it really, I talk about it now kind of proudly. I think there's enough clarity there. And crucially, people that work in governments can take this text to their environmental ministries or other parts and say, look, the science says this, but also 195 countries have agreed that we do need to reduce fossil fuels to stabilize the climate. So, yeah, so I think in the end, it's a complicated process, takes a lot of time and feels really inefficient. But in the end, I think there's something to be proud of and it has a bit more credibility because of that process.
Right, that's great. Okay, just to take us back to CDR world, in your book, you mentioned a lot actually earlier about Climeworks and some of their statements back a few years ago. It's been a few years since your book came out. Could you maybe just give us a sort of update on the status of DAC as you see it and where we're moving in that realm?
Yeah. So a few years later, where are we?
One thing, I remember they were saying they were going to have 1% of global emissions by 2025. Is that still on the schedule?
So that's 500 million tons a year by 2025. And, they're at something, Climeworks is at something like 5,000 or something like that now. So, a few orders of magnitude to go in the next 3 years. So that's a target that they don't actually take on now. And maybe for good reason. I think there is a sense that we're still in a phase of experimentation. And one thing that was really crucial for solar is, and it's been true for wind and also for batteries for electric vehicles, is this idea of coming up with a dominant design of a configuration that everybody agrees on. So for a long time, there were one blade wind turbines and 5-blade wind turbines and 2-blade and horizontal axis or vertical axis. There's a lot of experimentation. But when we got to the sense of saying, okay, we want a 3-blade upwind horizontal axis design, it allowed scale to really take off. There was a convergence of the industry. These standards really helped. And solar had the same thing in the mid 1980s about using purified silicon cut from wafers and how the contacts were aligned. And people were pretty much doing the same thing. There's a lot of experimentation before that. So I think with direct air capture, we're still in the experimentation phase. And that's why I think of 2030 as maybe being the deadline for getting to the dominant design, of figuring out what materials we're using, what sorbents we're using. And, maybe there's a few different designs that work for different applications. But I think the fact that we're still at small amounts is probably okay as long as we're getting on the road to larger amounts post 2030. So that's one thing I'd say. And then the second thing I'd say is it was disturbing to think, I don't know, this was probably 3 or 4 years ago when that book was being written, that there were really 3 commercial companies that were building stuff in direct air capture. And that seemed to had persisted for way too long. And it just seemed like if we're serious about this, we need more people working on it, more companies, more ideas. And we're definitely having that. And your organization is showing that clearly. So that part I find really heartening, is that there's such a breadth of effort and so many different pathways that are being worked on now.
Yeah, you kind of just answered my next question, which was going to be about, because dominant design, we've had, even in the past, I think 4 weeks, we've had different DAC companies on with very different approaches. So it seems like we're quite far from a dominant design. If there's going to be one, maybe there will be more than one process. But
yeah. And just on that, policy can play a really big role in affecting that. If you think about the next 5 years, say, whether policy supports diversity and even more different approaches, or whether policy in how it's designed can actually force convergence because it'll start rewarding the ones that are, for example, cheapest in the near term. And so I think there's an important kind of balance to get right on the policy side, and that we want to keep some options open and developing lots of ideas. But before too long, we do need to start focusing efforts so we can do the scale up part, which really has to go fast.
Yes, well, on the policy side, in terms of steering it too, there, one factor in solar that you mentioned is that it eventually became this brutally competitive commodity, but CDR is not really the same, because policymakers are going to take into consideration things like co-benefits, durability. Do we want a mass market on CDR that's delivering a low quality product? Like, is that acceptable? In 50 years from now? Do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think some low quality is acceptable if we think about units not lasting for 30 years but breaking some of the time. I think if we made if it's small and modular and the process is not dangerous, that's okay. And that might actually make things go a lot faster. If it's something where there's a lot of pressure and it's large scale, then you have to engineer against those failures happening, because one, if it goes offline, that takes the whole plant offline, and two, it actually could be dangerous to people and the surrounding communities. And so, yeah, there's places where the stakes are high and the stakes are not as high. And if they're not that high, that's a chance to focus on some other things that really matter. The other part that I think is crucial in terms of quality is what happens to the CO2 after it's been removed from the atmosphere. And that's where, there's a lot of variety in terms of how long it lasts and where it goes. And that's going to be crucial. I think that's really important to figure out, especially in the measurement and verification of it. But also, we might need to work in the near term on technologies where the sequestration part is not completely figured out. And I think that's okay. It's not okay in the long term, but it might be okay for scaling up the technology if we have niche markets where utilization happens that's not keeping it out of the atmosphere for very long. But that's a tricky one to navigate. But I think if there's a possibility of getting too strict on the sequestration part that might preclude a lot of developments on the capture part. And so we need to kind of think about those separately.
Yeah. I just want to ask some couple questions that would really be interesting to our community. We have a R&D community here who work on DAC and other CDR areas. Could you tell us a little bit more about the idea of the knowledge spillovers, what they are, how they help, and in the same vein, you had a section in the book about the importance of codifying and preserving knowledge as it moves from country to country, organization to organization, governments, etc.
Yeah. I mean, that was one of the biggest takeaways I had from, doing this work, researching the book. Is I interviewed people in 18 countries and traveled to lots of them and talked to them. And it was clear that there were personal stories of people that were, this guy that was a student in China that moved to Australia to pursue a graduate degree and kind of worked his way into a solar lab there, and eventually wanted to move back to China because he wanted to raise his family in China, but it just didn't seem like there was any possibility of doing solar there. And a little bit later there was, and he moved back and started a company there and eventually became the richest person in China for a few years. And that was the company that really started the solar scale up in China. And, that was a person, but it was a person moving around, and his mentor that was the professor that had 5 of the CTOs for the largest Chinese solar companies at one point. He was from Australia, went to school in Canada, then went to the US in the 80s to meet all the people, learn about the labs and get sources of equipment there. And so it was this international collaboration of ideas, but also people moving around, machines moving around, products, supplies, money, policy designs. It was absolutely crucial. And, one of the things I look at in terms of how can we make this go faster is I think we probably need even more knowledge spillovers than we had in solar if we want things to go faster, because there's different capabilities around the world. There's different policies that are feasible. There's different technical capacity. There's different ability to scale things up and make different things. And so we want to take advantage of all of that. It's a very globalist perspective. But then if you think about other technologies, like one I looked at in the book was looking at small and micro scale nuclear reactors. And there's ways that they could maybe have some of the iteration that would lead to improvements in mass production and cost reductions. And that seemed interesting. But there's so much restriction on nuclear technology in terms of, people having to have citizenship to even work in certain labs and making sure the technology doesn't move around to different places. And that to me just makes me think it's not going to go very fast at all. So yeah, I think the knowledge spillovers and what's happening with OpenAir especially is fantastic and crucial. And that's one of the most important ways we can make things go faster, which is just totally crucial if we need to get to gigatons by 2050.
Yeah. Well, I can ask you questions all day, but I'm going to turn it over to Chris for the audience Q&A, and I think he might have some questions for you too. Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, a lot of really great questions. Hopefully we can get to most of them, but please, folks, do join our Discord. We can continue the conversation after the session. These are subjects that we talk about all the time within our community. One thing I did want to just mention, you just mentioned the example of the individual who was on the technology and research side who kind of moved around from place to place. On the policy side, you also use a term often called a policy entrepreneur, who kind of is a similar type of person who sometimes is on the margin and comes up with an interesting idea. And those folks tend to be really critical, actually, in moving things forward, certainly in solar. So I wonder if you could just define or give a profile of the policy entrepreneur, and what kind of policy entrepreneurship are you seeing in CDR or DAC world right now that's encouraging to you?
Yeah, cool. Yeah. So I think, there's a lot of analogies from technology development and policy development. And so, there's policy innovation. And one of the policy innovations was in California. There were these long-term contracts for wind in the 1980s. In Japan, they had a declining rebate. And then there's policy diffusion, where ideas move around, just like technologies get diffused in different places. And that's what the Germans did. They combined the California standard offer contracts with the Japanese declining subsidy for their feed-in tariff. And the other thing that came up in that time was a policy window. So there'd been a policy entrepreneur named Hans-Josef Fell who was working on solar, advocating it, implementing it in different cities in Germany. And then there was an election in 1998, and the Greens and the Social Democrats were in a coalition. And all of a sudden, the Greens had a chance to really move this through. And so they had the policy designer, Hans-Josef Fell, and the policy entrepreneur, Hermann Scher, who understood that this was an important issue, had all the contacts, had the ability to move people in the center to work on this. And then they got it passed, and then they just escalated it over time. And so that's kind of what you're looking for, is someone like in that profile who kind of knows how the system works, has some way to sell it, and is able to use the experience of how it's been developed before to make the case that this is going to be affordable, that this will have co-benefits, this is actually going to solve the problem, that this is something that we want to do. And he was able to make that case. And so, and then having the time when it's ready, when the political coalition and the conditions are right for it. And they had that in 1998, and they focused on it. And then from there, they kept it in place in a strong way for the next 17 years. And that was actually crucial. And then on the CDR part, that's where we're kind of looking for the same, is to someone who can say, look, this is what's happened before. Here's some text that's ready to go. And here's the policy window to take care of it. We've worked with Clemens in Luxembourg. He's like this entrepreneurial character who sees the value, sees that it could play a role here, and has some text and is working on it. And then I think now, his thing is, let's find the policy window, the time when the conditions are right to really have this happen. And, Luxembourg's tiny, it's not going to make any difference in terms of gigatons, but it's part of the EU. And so there's ability to leverage things and scale up. And so that kind of vision to make things go bigger, similar to bottom-up policy, like working at the municipal level, like you've been doing, is crucial too, because it proves things. And maybe there's a particular municipality where it actually, is receptive to it, shows that it can work. It's not going to be big enough to make a big difference, but that doesn't matter because it shows that it works, and then you can scale it up afterwards. And that's something we've seen again and again. I think that's a really promising way to get policy for CDR.
Yeah, people sometimes wonder why we focus on the Luxembourgs or states or cities. It's exactly the way you said. It's not sort of a fetishization of the local. It's more, where can you get it instantiated somewhere in the world and then virally spread it? And so there's real advantages to those lower levels or smaller states. And just one comment, I think that much of what you've been talking about today, what's really interesting is a lot of the resistance to CDR doesn't take into account these phenomena that you're talking about that we see again and again, that both technology and policy evolve in unpredictable ways. And there's often an assumption of just a certain stasis about where we are, that's why I keep trying to encourage critics to read your book. But I'm going to link together two really great questions, actually, from two folks that we really admire within the open air community. We have Pete Chargin, who's a really active member in California, and then Alyssa Vandenbush, who's a policy entrepreneur in her own right. The first one that Pete asks is, in your first slide, you talked about the progression. Is it possible to skip a stage or dramatically reduce the length of a stage, or do stages sometimes move non-sequentially? And then Alyssa asked, what policies are most important right now to kind of drive that change? So I think that these are kind of linked questions, and I wonder if you can respond to them.
Yeah. So these are like the gigaton questions. These are the $1 trillion questions. Yeah, that's a great question to ask. I guess my simple answer was, you can make things go faster, but you can't skip. And I think we have enough examples of technologies where we've tried to skip. We've tried to go big right away. Wind turbines in the early 1970s, oil crisis. We knew then you needed megawatt scale. We're now at 10 megawatt scale, but you need a megawatt scale to actually have an economical wind turbine. And so Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, the US, Germany built these gigantic wind turbines. And the country that ended up and is still the leader in wind turbines is a tiny country called Denmark that just took 20 years to scale it up. And they got it to work. They got it to prove. And so, maybe the question is, could they have done it in 10 years? But the idea that you could go big right away, I think we've seen over and over that that's a path to failure, either because there's not technical competence, maybe there's not a supply chain ready, or maybe public acceptance isn't ready for it either, because that takes time as well. And so I work a lot now on how we can move things faster, but I don't think you can skip steps. You got to go small, gradually upscale, and do it faster, but not skip.
Great. And this links to another thing that Pete asked at the very end, which we're obsessed about at OpenAir, and this really comes directly from your book and from the solar experience, is the importance of niche markets. That can you find these places where DAC could deliver value that's not the ultimate end game of taking carbon out of the air and storing it in basalt or somewhere else, but where can we sort of fit in to sort of test it out, scale up, get costs down? Do you see the same do we have time for that kind of approach for DAC? What role do you see niche markets playing in DAC's development?
Yeah, niche markets are crucial. They were crucial for solar, even though people make fun of them, like, making solar with toys or solar and calculators, solar and watches. Those aren't going to do anything for the energy system. Yeah, of course not. But they get the technology proven, they get companies to take it seriously, and then you go bigger after that. And similarly now, if you think about, using captured CO2 in beverages or something like that, well, that's just going to go right back into the atmosphere. That's an expensive way to just recycle some CO2. But that's not the point of it. The point of it is to find a market where people are willing to pay. And people pay today for CO2 to put into old oil wells, or CO2 to make beverages, or CO2 to enhance agricultural production in greenhouses. And so those are markets that crucially have a high willingness to pay, and two, they don't depend on policy. And so you don't need a policy for those technologies to say, or for those markets to say, we value CO2 just for the CO2. And there were like solar, they were small over time. They led you to bigger markets, and eventually the markets where you could subsidize it and go even bigger. And then eventually where you don't need to subsidize anymore and get even bigger. And that's where solar is now. And that's kind of where CDR and DAC, has a progression to go to. And so that's why I say, I don't worry too much about the beverage markets or even the enhanced oil recovery of CO2 that ends up just going mostly back into the atmosphere, because it's proving the capture part. It's getting technology or companies to take it seriously. And then eventually you start working on the permanent sequestration after that. So there's a sequence to that too. It all has to happen really quickly. But again, I think there's a sequence, and niche markets are crucial because they're not vulnerable to the whims of policymakers in the way that just policy created markets are.
Absolutely. So concrete is an exciting one for us, as Toby just posted. We're working really hard on that one.
Yeah.
Really good question from a real superstar member of the open air community, Dahl Winters, which I think flows nicely from what you just put forth. You had mentioned there being feedbacks involved in scaling up these technologies, for example, in solar. Can you mention what some of these might be?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like actually using a technology in the real world to see what happens to it over time. And you can design a perfectly efficient or a 20% efficient cell in the lab, but when you put it under real light ambient conditions and there's dust and the plastic that is sealing the glass to the rest of the module is degrading over time, that's how you learn, okay, we need a new material for our sealant, or we have to figure out a way to avoid the dust, or we need a new coating on our panel because our anti-reflective coating gets scraped off if it's in a desert environment. And that leads to R&D to say, okay, we need a new material, let's work on that, let's integrate it. And so there's this feedback from the market that goes in the technology development that's crucial. And that's why I think those iterations are so crucial. Like solar's got 1 billion chances to do that. Nuclear's had something like 900. And so direct air capture and other CDR, where you get chances to experiment, try it in the real world, see what happens to the CO2, see what happens to the components, that's going to really help and get things so that we can scale up to do it quickly.
Yeah. And it's not just the feedback on the technology, it's the feedback on the context of application. You know, as a solar guy, I worked in rural India, Afghanistan, but also Brooklyn. You really have to get feedback from the local context to sort of not only understand if it's going to work, but get new ideas. So absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
So this is another important question from my fellow OpenAir co-founder, Matt Parker, who really kind of advances our R&D work. And OpenAir, the open part, is the other part, in addition to sort of network-based advocacy. We think that open source is the other key to unlocking fast rates of advancement. So what Matt asked is, someone who's inspired by the possibility of open hardware and wants it to play a role in advancing CDR, I wonder if you've charted the rate of advancement of an open hardware technology like 3D printing or other open source technology.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't looked at that directly. I was just talking with a colleague on a project before who's been doing a case study of, additive manufacturing in industry and how that can reduce cost. But yeah, I'm very much along the lines of what you're talking about. I think one of the things that has been helpful for solar is that really none of the intellectual property, the patenting that was implemented in solar has really blocked alternatives to that, or has really slowed things down too much. I mean, I think that's crucial. And when we think about where we are today, the problems that we have, the size of the potential markets, trillions of dollars. If you're doing 5 gigatons at $100, it's trillions. How do we get that to happen with intellectual property? And I think the key is that, those markets are big enough that you don't need a lot of government protection or government monopolies to make enough profit to justify your investments in it, because the markets are so big. So yeah, I think this idea of the open architecture, and especially for 3D printing, like you say, is one of the things that'll make things go faster. And the other side to it is to say, well, nobody will invest because they don't have a patent and they won't get a payoff on their investment. I just don't think that's a realistic argument today, because the markets are so big and the problems are so important that we're going to invest anyway. We just need to make things go faster, people get access to it, and the openness helps with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dirk Passler has a really, really good question. We're talking a lot about DAC here, but how do you think we can apply the learnings from scaling solar, i.e. iteration, modularity, dynamics, to other CDR approaches, especially enhanced weathering, ocean-based CDR, cropland, et cetera?
Yeah, I think we need other models, not solar. And that's what we're doing in this Genie project. So spent last week in Berlin talking about our project, and the one we're working on now is biochar. And we had a biochar expert there, and he also worked in the solar industry. And so he's like focusing on growth rates and how do we scale up. But we've been saying, well, we need other things besides solar to learn from. And so we've been looking at scale up of fertilizer production and how that grows and how that has led to corn ethanol and how that industry developed in Brazil, especially. And so we're trying to look at other analogies of things that have grown quickly, that have some direct analogy to the one we're talking about. And so, yeah, moving into looking at other other examples to inform these other CDR techniques, I think is important, because there's a lot to learn from what's worked, because all these are nascent. And so there's not a lot of history to say, okay, yeah, we can grow at 40% a year, or we can learn at 20% learning rate. These are too new to have evidence for that. And so using technologies that are similar is the way to go on that.
Yeah, this links to a question from Mission Collaborative, which I might expand a little bit. And he asked, what CDR companies, but let's say what CDR pathways, when we look across that spectrum, do you think are most promising right now along the lines of what you really laid out for DAC, in terms of ones that are maybe most subject to innovation and rapid change? Looking across the whole spectrum from nature to engineered, are there ones that you think are most interesting or promising?
I mean, I guess the number one thing is I like the diversity of approaches. I like that we're doing that there's not just 3 companies working on DAC now. 5 years ago, there was only 3 companies. I think that's helpful. Like that there's more than DAC. There's a lot of these other approaches as well. And then beyond that, I would have to say, like, this small scale modular part, I just find it so convincing. It just keeps coming back. And I just think, there probably is a role for some large scale, but if we're going to do this in a big way, that's gigatons by 2050, it's using the iteration, the small scale modular, many niche scale. I think the technologies in that area just seem like the ones that are ready to go fast. The ones that are big and heavy, maybe they work, maybe they play a role, but it's just hard to see how they go fast. And then ultimately, because all these have to be big, there's a big public acceptance role that's going to be crucial here. And the small usually do better on that as well. And so there's something about this modular approach that it just seems to keep coming back to be the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. We have so many good questions here. So I do hope that people will come in, and maybe we can encourage Professor Nemet to jump into the Discord one of these days and
Right.
have a more open chat, because there's some great questions. But we are at time. And so with that, thanks, Professor Nemet. I'm going to pass it over to Jared to close us out.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, guys. That was great. I will just add, I was just looking in the Q&A. A lot of these questions are answered in Greg's book, in questions we didn't get to are answered in his book. So check it out. It's really a great resource. Sorry, can you see my screen? So I'll just tell you about next week's events. We are going to have Puro.earth, which is a standards and registry company. Next, it's Carbon Minerals, who I believe this won an X Prize. They work in enhanced rock weathering. Captura is on the 14th, which is ocean-based CDR. And then we have many more coming this summer. So follow us on Twitter, and even better, join us. Thank you so much. We'll leave the chat and the Q&A up for people if they want to grab some links or anything that they didn't have time to grab yet. And we'll see you all next time. Thank you so much. Bye.